It's a mass scale dehumanization of anyone that does not neatly align with their politics and their theological vision of the world. And I think we need to be knowing in our minds what line getting crossed would put me in the streets as a protester. And that's the last line of defense when an authoritarian tries to steal an election. And at that point, then it becomes about peaceful protest resisting the authoritarian turn in the streets.
So the definition of a concentration camp became the mass detention of civilians without due process on the basis of identity. Countries resort to this when a party or a leader wants to entrench or expand power. Do you want a society that can do this to people? And it turns out most Americans don't want that society. And so by you showing up and saying that publicly somehow, it lets other people know that you don't like it, they don't like it. It's making this government super, super unpopular. And every time we can move that even an inch, it opens new doors.
Welcome to episode 283 of the Refuse Fascism podcast, a podcast brought to you by volunteers with Refuse Fascism. I'm Sam Goldman, one of those volunteers and host of the show. Refuse Fascism works to unite all who can be united to non-violently drive the Trump fascist regime from power. This week, we're sharing two interviews. First, a conversation with Matthew D. Taylor on Christian nationalists and the U.S.-Israeli war on Iran, followed by a discussion with Andrea Pitzer on Trump's concentration camps. As always, we want to give a thank you to everyone who rates and reviews the podcast, supports us on Patreon, subscribes on Substack, picks up a hat or a shirt on our merch store. That support is how this platform keeps going and growing. And if you're listening and you're like, ooh, I haven't done that yet, after this episode, take a moment, share this show with a friend, subscribe on Substack, write a review, become a patron. All of it helps us get these ideas out where they actually need to be, because the stakes of what we're confronting right now could not be higher. There is no living with this Trump MAGA fascism. Every day, reality drives this truth home more forcefully. What we are confronting is not politics as usual. It is not just the worst administration or the pendulum swinging hard right. What we are confronting is a fascist regime, a white supremacist, misogynist, American supremacist, anti-scientific Christian fascist movement that rules through open terror and brute force. It is a regime that targets its real or perceived enemies and seeks to crush anyone who they deem stands in their way. And every day, the character of this regime becomes clearer and clearer. They are going for nothing short of overt dictatorship, but they haven't locked it down yet. One section of the ruling class, those in the Republican Party in this country, have decided that the way forward for their system is fascism, and they are using the full force of the state to impose it. The exploitation and oppression that have always defined this system have become raw, aggressive, and undisguised. In January, the Trump fascist regime invaded Venezuela, kidnapped their president. They gunned down civilians in Minneapolis for daring to stand up to its ICE Gestapo. Now, Trump has launched a war of aggression on Iran, already killing thousands and rapidly escalating toward a wider regional war and the real possibility of all-out nuclear catastrophe. And Trump is making clear that Iran is not the end of this aggression. He is openly threatening that other countries could be next. Just listen to what he said this week about Cuba.
We're also looking forward to the great change that will soon be coming to Cuba. Cuba's at the end of the line. They're very much at the end of the line. They have no money. They have no oil. They have a bad philosophy. Cuba's in its last moments.
This is the voice of a fascist regime announcing to the world that no country has the right to exist outside the dictates of U.S. domination. Trump is reviving the role of imperialist bully, the idea that the United States can invade, overthrow, or destroy governments wherever, whenever it chooses. We are at a tipping point of extreme danger for humanity, for the planet. And I feel like it might be weird for me to say this now, but in case there's any confusion amongst listeners, This fascism is not weakening. It's hardening. The Republican Party and the MAGA movement are rallying around Trump's program of lawless international aggression, even as there's real conflict over how they see Iran, and we'll get to that in this episode, genocidal white supremacy, relentless persecution of immigrants, threats against political opponents, and the subversion of elections. Right now, Trump is openly threatening to not sign any legislation until Congress passes the SAVE Act, which, as I'm sure you know, as listeners to this pod, it's an extreme voter suppression, voter erosion act. Trump has demanded via Truth Social, quote, go for the gold, must show voter IDs and proof of citizenship, no mail-in ballots except for military, illness, disability, travel, no men and women's sports, no transgender mutilation for children, do not fail, end quote. And he has already threatened to bypass Congress entirely with an executive order imposing voter identification requirements nationwide if lawmakers don't comply. All of this underscores a truth we have to face. There is no living with this Trump MAGA fascism. There's no negotiating with it, no managing it, no waiting it out. And yet, that's exactly what we're told the answer is. Wait it. Wait it out. Wait for midterms. Wait for 2028. Wait for the system to correct itself. But you cannot defeat fascism by waiting for elections that the fascists themselves are working to sabotage, nullify, or control. And while people are told to wait, this regime is hunting down and kidnapping immigrants. They are burning the planet, escalating wars, and pushing humanity toward catastrophe, while elements of its rabid base openly welcome apocalyptic war as part of a twisted vision of Armageddon. This madman cannot be allowed to keep his finger on the nuclear trigger for another day, let alone another year. And yet, Democratic Party leadership keeps telling people to calm down. They tell you to channel your fear and outrage into the next election, into the midterms. They tell us to look at his deep unpopularity. They tell us we are winning. No, humanity is not winning. But here's the truth. History shows that regimes, even powerful regimes, can be forced from power when millions of people refuse to accept them as legitimate, when people fill the streets and sustain nonviolent resistance in such a way that forces every section of those in power to respond. When they, the people, refuse to cooperate with grave injustice, when they create a political crisis the regime cannot simply govern through, history can change. We can change it. The question before the millions of decent people in this country is whether we're going to accept this fascist future or refuse it. Because there is no accommodating with this regime. There's no waiting them out. There is no living with this Trump MAGA fascism, which is why the demand that meets this moment is clear. Trump must go now. The whole Trump fascist regime must go now. We can change this trajectory. We have a real chance if we wake up, if we change the game, if we fill the streets with nonviolent resistance, if we refuse with every ounce of our being to let this regime steal our collective future. Which is why I hope you'll join Refuse Fascism on No King's Day, Saturday, March 28th. I hope you'll be part of building powerful Refuse Fascism contingents that can speak to millions and organize thousands into the movement to non-violently drive this regime from power. See the show notes to learn more and to join in. We're a little over a week into a criminal war of aggression against Iran. The reason for this war is no mystery. Iran is resource rich and geographically strategic to anyone who wants to exert power across the globe. The U.S. overthrew the democratically elected, socialist-leaning Mossadegh government in 1953 in response to efforts to nationalize oil production and installed the murderous Shah regime. Following the revolution in 1979, the Islamic regime was gradually incorporated into the global market, but remained a thorn in the side of U.S. interests in the region. The United States has attempted to undermine and overthrow the Ayatollahs ever since. That's undisputed. But why now? Because Trump's promise to the American ruling class is that breaking down the rule of law domestically and internationally will enable the U.S. empire to brazenly pursue its interests using the full lethal force of the most powerful military the world has ever seen. And I just have to speak to Israel's role in this war because so many bad takes. In the Gaza genocide, Israel has normalized the bombing of schools, hospitals, and the destruction of civilian infrastructure. Tactics which are blatantly against international law and which the U.S. clearly aims to replicate on a much greater scale here. And this war does serve Israel's interests. But Israel did not drag the U.S. into this war. American soldiers aren't fighting for Israel for the simple reason that Israel fundamentally exists to advance American interests in the region. The reason that the United States protects, funds, arms, and supports the Israeli state is not because Jews have some mystical or financial control over the U.S. elite. It's the same reason they protect, fund, arm, and support every other military base around the world. Now, let's talk about dumb wars. Trump and Vance and Hegseth have claimed that their war on Iran is totally different from invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, that those wars were dumb. They claim that this war is smart. That's literally the whole argument. So what are they talking about? What they seem to mean is that by shredding international law and what Hegseth calls stupid rules of engagement, they will be able to physically overwhelm Iran's military, government, people, and territory. Trump is demanding unconditional surrender, and he's simultaneously saying the U.S. will not be involved in nation building or occupation. They want the benefits of total subordination without the responsibility of colonial governance. Dumb isn't the right word. Hubris is much closer. It's worth thinking about Stephen Miller's supposedly iron laws of the world: strength, force, and power. It's very likely that in the coming weeks, the fascist worldview will be clashing against realities that they cannot comprehend. Iran is a vast country, and much of its geography is perilous for invading forces. Their military is much more advanced, sophisticated, and cohesive than Iraq's was in 2003. The country has over 90 million people with deeply rooted and widespread hatred of U.S. imperialism, both among the well-organized supporters of the regime and amongst many opponents of the regime. Without a crystal ball, we cannot say whether this will ultimately go well for the American fascists or not. But what we can almost guarantee is that what we are seeing is just a small sliver of the bloodshed to come. This war must be resolutely and urgently opposed, and this regime, the Trump fascist regime, must be driven from power. To explore the Christian fascist crusaderism and Armageddon maxing in MAGA, here is my interview with Matthew D. Taylor. Today, I'm happy to be speaking with writer, scholar, podcaster Matthew D. Taylor. Matt is a visiting scholar at the Center on Faith and Justice at Georgetown University, where he researches Christian nationalism and theological resistance to authoritarianism. He's the author of several books, including The Violent Ticket by Force and the forthcoming Defying Tyrants. Matt, welcome back to Refuse Fascism.
Glad to be here. Thanks.
We are speaking Friday, March 6th, at a moment when the Trump regime has launched a dangerous new war of aggression on Iran. And what's especially chilling, in addition to the fact that this war could spell game over for humanity, is the fact that some of Trump's most enthusiastic religious supporters interpret conflict in the Middle East not as a catastrophe to avoid, but as part of a biblical prophecy leading to Armageddon. And the idea that apocalyptic religious movements are cheering on a war that could spiral into regional, even global catastrophe is something that really is hard to wrap your head around, I think, for most people, myself included. And I'm wondering from your research, how real, how influential is that apocalyptic worldview, and how is it shaping that movement's attitude towards this war?
So it is very real. It is very influential, but it's not unifying. Throughout Christian history, throughout the background of the Christian tradition, there are these kind of dueling impulses when it comes to Jews in Israel. And broadly, we label one of those impulses anti-Semitism. And most people know what that means, thinking that Jews are different from the rest of humanity and therefore they should be feared and maybe even hated. And then the other side is what we would call philo-Semitism, which some people think of it as the opposite of anti-Semitism, but it's not the opposite. It's in many ways the other side of the same coin. Philo-Semitism, very simply, is the idea that Jews are different than the rest of humanity, and therefore they should be loved and supported. But these both start with a dehumanizing move, separating Jews from humanity, and then it becomes a question of, well, what's the mood of the person who holds that view, and in terms of how they then relate to Jews and Judaism and Israel. Both of those impulses are very much on display right now in the Christian nationalist or the far-right Christian world. Candace Owens and Nick Fuentes and Tucker Carlson, who are Christian nationalists, but they're very opposed to what's going on in Iran. Here we're talking about the philo-Semitic side of the Christian far-right, what is often labeled more popularly Christian Zionism. And I would define Christian Zionism as not all Christians who support the state of Israel. Joe Biden's a Christian. He's also a Zionist. He's not a Christian Zionist, though, because Christian Zionism is a theological project. It's a view rooted in Christian theology about the role of Israel and the role of Jews in the end of the world. And it really emerges with the rise of Protestantism after the 16th century, especially it emerges in the late 19th and early 20th century, and becomes very, very influential in the United States and our politics, and also in the founding of the State of Israel. By the time of the founding of the State of Israel in 1948, you had Christian Zionists campaigning for decades, sometimes often in alliance with Jewish Zionists, but with their own agenda and with their own plan. And those plans always have to do with what broadly in the Christian tradition we call eschatology, which is just theology about the end of the world. Eschaton in Greek is the last things, what happens in the end. And so because there are passages in the New Testament and in the Hebrew Bible that Christians have interpreted as centering Jews and Israel in the kind of conclusion of Christian history when Jesus comes back, this has become a sort of fixation for many, many Christians, especially for the spectrum of evangelical Christians. And there's different styles and different versions of Christian Zionism. There's kind of the old style, what we would call dispensationalism. This is what's called rapture theology. This is the idea that, well, you just need to get all the Jews back to Israel and then Jesus is going to come back, right? That's kind of the old version of Christian Zionism. And then there's this new, more accelerationist style of Christian Zionism that has really taken over within the last, I'd say, 30 years. That is more charismatic in its theology and orientation. And here we're using charismatic not as like magnetic personality people with riz. We're talking about a style of Christian theology that is deeply supernatural, that is rooted in experiences that individual Christians have that they perceive as being supernatural, things like speaking in tongues or being conduits for prophecy or miracles. It's a very miraculous kind of conception of Christianity, very supernaturalist conception of Christianity. And this has become very, very popular around the world. Christian Zionism is not an exclusively American phenomenon. You can find it all over the place in Brazil and in South America and in South Korea and in Africa and in the subcontinent. I mean, this is proliferating throughout global Christianity. But within that frame of Christian Zionism, again, the premise is you support Israel no matter what, because Israel is God's dedicated nation. Christian Zionism, I like to say, is pro-Israel. It's not pro-Jewish. It's very supportive of the state of Israel, very, very invested and interested. And you'll often see these Christian Zionist leaders hanging out with Israeli politicians, coordinating, building these big projects with Netanyahu and all these people. I mean, when Netanyahu comes to the United States now, he is often meeting with Christian groups, not with Jewish groups, because he knows that is where the most ardent support for the state of Israel is. And now with this more charismatic style of Christian Zionism, there's this more accelerationist impulse. The old school Christian Zionism was kind of like, we need Israel to exist and then Jesus comes back at some point. The new style says Israel needs to exist and be dominant and needs to take over more territory and live out the biblical promises for Israel and enact this kind of Jewish dominion over that region that will complement the Christian dominion over the rest of the world, and will build the kingdom of God on earth. All the Jews will convert and then Jesus will come back. It's a much more willing to brook a kind of warfare, expansionist, imperialist vision for the Middle East. And I think that has gotten a lot of Christians, including people like Mike Huckabee, the American ambassador to Israel, wrapped around the axle of this theology that then drives their vision of foreign policy, drives their unwavering support for the state of Israel no matter what, and is kind of fueling and creating really the kind of fabric of this authoritarian synchronicity between what's happening in Israel right now and what's happening in the United States right now.
How is that movement responding to Trump's, in conjunction with Israel's war on Iran?
They are thrilled, especially when we're talking about the charismatic folks. They interpret all of this, everything that happens in the world, but especially in the Middle East, through the lens of what they call spiritual warfare. And spiritual warfare very basically is this idea that there are angels and demons, real angels and demons that you can't see. They're invisible, but they are all over the place. They are everywhere, and they are affecting humanity and even controlling certain portions of humanity at times. And the task of Christians who can participate in this kind of invisible warfare through prayer, through singing worship songs, through even kind of these dedicated prayer and spiritual warfare trips. The idea is we displace those demons, and then Christians can grow and Christianity can grow in those spaces. If you go into some of the places that I track in charismatic Christian media and charismatic Christian podcasts and some of these televangelism shows, today the way that they're talking about the war in Iran is the demons are being cast out of Iran, the demon of Islam. They'll even reference this passage from the book of Daniel about the prince of Persia, this kind of ambiguous figure in the Hebrew Bible, and say that's a demon that reigns over Iran. And right now what is happening is an exorcism of that demon. And they'll equate what is happening through the military with their own spiritual warfare, right? Just kind of two languages of warfare. And what this does is it's a mass scale dehumanization of anyone that does not neatly align with their politics and their theological vision of the world. And those people are under the sway of demons. And so they just need to be liberated. And once they're liberated, they'll all agree with us. And so a lot of the ways that these folks talk is not just about, oh, well, this is good for Israel. They'll even say, well, this is good for Iran because the people there want to become Christians. They just are being held back by these demons that are holding power, that are enshrining Islam over that nation. And if we could just liberate them, then suddenly they'll all become Christians and we'll see this grand revival and we'll be a part of this expansion. What is happening right now, they truly see it as an apocalyptic sign, but it's not like they think Armageddon's happening tomorrow. It's more that they are thinking of these as kind of the building blocks towards global Christian supremacy, global Judeo-Christian supremacy, towards kind of building the kingdom of God on earth. And they see Iran and really any Muslim nation, frankly, as a barrier to that expansion. And so when Israel attacks, they're stalwartly with Israel. And now that America's involved, they'll say, look, we're seeing this kind of Judeo-Christian Western alliance displacing these horrible demonic cultures, and we're going to replace them with Jesus as they understand him.
Really important context. Some have commented that the crusade mentality isn't new. We saw expressions of this for sure under George Bush. But there is a difference, not just theologically speaking of who has advanced as the most prominent voices, but also like how that is expressed politically, I feel like, within this regime. I mean, it's probably like best epitomized by like a Pete Hegseth character, where there's that celebration in the violence that's like connected to something spiritual for them, I feel like. I think it's disturbing in this moment that the beliefs that you're talking about aren't just on the fringe anymore, which is something that I know you've written about, but these ideas of prophecy, of spiritual warfare, of America's divine mission are increasingly connected to people inside the Trump's governing coalition. You know, I talked about Pete Hegseth openly talking about America as a Christian nation, framing global conflict in civilizational and religious terms. And I'm wondering, like, from your perspective, how do you see these ideas embedded in the political power structure around Trump? And how is that shaping the political environment around issues, in particular, this war?
So that's part of why I started out where I did, that you have this divergence today between the anti-Semitic far right and the philo-Semitic far right. And I think of Pete Hegseth actually as a kind of complicated figure right in the middle of those things. He grew up Baptist. As far as I can tell, for a period of his life was a kind of ardent Christian Zionist. There's this now kind of infamous video of him in 2018 speaking at the King David Hotel in Jerusalem to a group of apparently Jewish donors. It's not totally clear who's in the audience. And he is talking openly about building the third temple, which, if readers understand anything about that, would entail removing two of the holiest sites in Islam in order for Jews to build a third temple on top of Mount Zion. That is a wild Christian Zionist idea, but it's something Christian Zionists will often kind of speculate and kind of dream about and fantasize about. But then now he is much more aligned theologically and in terms of his own belonging with the more anti-Semitic side of the Christian right. And so right now in the United States, you have Christian nationalists, this kind of Christian Zionist side that is ardently pro-war with Iran. And then you've got this anti-Semitic side that is ardently anti-war with Iran. And within that side of the kind of far right, this is the kind of Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, Nick Fuentes kind of world. Within that side of the far right, they see this as they're playing into all these kind of anti-Semitic tropes. It's Israel is leading the United States around by the nose. It's these Jewish cabal that is guiding everything, right? It's kind of playing into all the tropes of Christian anti-Semitism. And Hegseth seems like he is more aligned with that side of the coalition. You don't hear him overtly espousing ideas of Christian Zionism, but he seems to be very excited about the war. I think for Hegseth, the way that he squares the circle is he loves the Crusades. I mean, he wrote an entire book titled American Crusade, and part of his love of the Crusades, I think, is inspired by his deep, deep hatred for Muslims and Islam. I'm not trying to be hyperbolic. I mean, go and read some of the things he said and written about Muslims and about Islam. He really does think in this kind of neo-crusader mentality. And he also just loves war. And frankly, he just loves war criminals. Again, I'm not being hyperbolic. He has defended war criminals almost across the board. If they are war criminals on the side he believes in, they are justified no matter what in Pete Hegseth's mindset. And so I think he is a Western supremacist. I think he's a Christian supremacist. I think he has a fetishization of the Crusades, and he sees all of this in line with that. Not as kind of a pro-Israel endeavor per se. I have no idea what he actually thinks about Israel today, how he kind of calibrates that theologically. In fact, his own mentors have been people who've been more aligning with this kind of anti-Semitic side. But I think in his ethos, he's pro-war, he's pro-muscular, masculine American military expansionism, and he hates Muslims. And so he can put all those pieces together and say, see, we're doing the Crusades again, therefore this is righteous. But again, he is trying to kind of hold these things together in a complicated way because I think in his own instincts today, I sense at least that he's aligned a lot more with the other side of this. And yet he keeps showing up as being one of the spokespeople for the war.
That was really helpful. I'm wondering about people like Johnson. They would fit more Christian Zionist type, more of the traditional type, right?
Yeah, all the old guard of the evangelical religious right, and that's very much who Mike Johnson is. I mean, he is a creature of the American religious right, came up as a lawyer within the Alliance Defending Freedom, which is kind of one of the main legal outfits of the religious right, and has spent decades, has basically spent his entire career navigating these circles of pro-Israel, Christian Zionist, evangelical culture. Now, Mike Johnson's a Southern Baptist, so he's not necessarily as tied in with all these kind of charismatic prophecies and those things. He's more of a kind of conventional Christian Zionist, but very much in league with these more accelerationist Christian Zionists. And really, right now, what we're seeing is this fracture within the MAGA coalition, a kind of low-grade civil war inside the MAGA coalition between these more Christian Zionists, Christian imperialists, globally minded Christians, not globally minded in the sense they care about other people, but globally minded in that they want Christians through America to take over the globe, versus these more nativist, nationalist, blood and soil, Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, Nick Fuentes, frankly, Nazi sympathizing anti-Semites who really want to kind of lock this thing down into a kind of blood and soil nationalism. And it's gotten to the point where, I mean, I don't know if you saw this, but Tucker Carlson has been so overt in his opposition to this war that he earned a rebuke from Donald Trump this week. I mean, that is not something that happens in MAGA. Tucker Carlson is a very big brand. Donald Trump does not tend to run up against those big brands. He tends to kind of want to keep them all under this vague tent that he runs, and he can be an ambiguous signifier to all of them. But he's gotten worried because he has thrown in very hard with the kind of Christian Zionist side, at least in this moment. I mean, he'll play footsie with the anti-Semites when he wants to, right? But right now, he really needs the support of the Christian Zionists with this war. And so he's willing to have a feud with Tucker Carlson. And I think really what that internal MAGA civil war is about, it's not just about Israel. It's not just about Jews, and it's not just about expansion and interventionism versus anti-interventionism. It's really about what is the spiritual future of the MAGA coalition. Is it going to go the way of Nazism and focus more on kind of policing internal kind of dissension and trying to kind of lock down this kind of definition of what it means to be American? Or does it go the way of Vladimir Putin, right? A more an imperialist vision of expansion and growth, a new American empire. The war in Iran is more of a new American empire project, and Tucker Carlson wants to do the blood and soil nativist project.
And Nazis also did have an expansionist project as part of it. So their view of history is warped, seeing the part of it that speaks most deeply to their hatred, at least in my opinion.
And that's the thing, just like anti-Semitism and philo-Semitism are not opposites, nationalism and imperialism are not opposites. They're kind of part of a continuum. And what we're seeing right now is, I think in the first Trump administration, you could pretty coherently talk about that the Trump administration itself is philo-Semitic and Christian Zionist and more kind of aligned around kind of this charismatic and old evangelical establishment coalition. Part of the story of the second Trump administration so far has been the reemergence in many ways of the anti-Semitic far right and their assertion. This is not happening on the fringes. I mean, Candace Owens, Tucker Carlson, they are getting millions of views of all the podcasts that they're doing. They are reaching more people than any Fox News personality and are more influential than any Fox News personality today. And so you really do have an emergence of a form of American Nazism today that I would argue you did not see, at least not in these kind of numbers and in this kind of force in the first Trump administration. But it does tend to be this more nativist, anti-interventionist, which I would agree is not historically always what the Nazi kind of ideology has trended towards. But within their kind of formulation of it is more about locking down the borders and then policing internal dissent as opposed to these kind of adventures abroad.
And obviously, not in their view is seeing in the way that I think Trump and Miller do is the dynamism between the two, the dynamism between the violence abroad and the repression at home, which I think is acutely aware of and is living for. This is the moment. I'm wondering, how does that tension work out? Because I think a lot of times people on the outside, you see these battles in Trump land and people want so much for them to self-destruct. They're banking on that, but that hasn't really been ever in the Trump world. It has not spelled the end of Trump. How do you see this working out? They're not a very compromising people, and yet they sure seem to compromise when it comes to Trump.
I think the MAGA coalition has always been a motley crew. And I think part of the brilliance of Donald Trump as a politician is his ability to be an ambiguous signifier to so many different types of people. Trump's kind of style, his charisma, it's kind of this universal adapter that everyone on the right has found a way to plug into. The crux of that, the center of that ethos is that Donald Trump is a messiah who is going to save us all, is going to deliver Western civilization, going to deliver American Christianity, deliver white people from being, not having all the power in society, right? They can all kind of plug into his ambition. He doesn't really code neatly with any of these folks, right? He'll have dinner with Nick Fuentes and Kanye West and kind of throw a bone to the anti-Semites, and he'll hang out with Tucker Carlson and all, right? But then Paula White Cain, who is one of the most influential Christians in the country and an avid Christian Zionist, his kind of closest religious advisor, and she has stacked the realm of his religious advisors with people like her. And so he can be this kind of ambiguous signifier. J.D. Vance can't be an ambiguous signifier. He's very much kind of aligned with this more kind of Nazi Tucker Carlson side of this debate. And that's part of why I think he's been so quiet about the war so far. But the reality is we have no idea how this plays out. It's tempting, I think, for us, people who are not in that kind of far right argument, to start trying to pick sides and say, oh, here's who I want to win this, right? Oh, wouldn't it be great if this... It's bad for the United States. It is bad for the world, whichever side wins this debate. It's going to have a huge impact on our politics and probably will shape the next couple generations of American politics, frankly, at least on the far right. And frankly, today, there's not really a clean line that you can find between the right and the far right. The far right is the mainstream of the MAGA coalition today. And so what happens within there is very, very important. And these kind of spiritual, theological, kind of philo-Semitic, anti-Semitic debates are very, very important for us to understand. I'm not rooting for either of these sides. In fact, if either of these sides emerges as victorious and consolidates the MAGA coalition in the future, I think that's actually a very, very dangerous state. If anything, it's probably better for them to be warring internally and not consolidating around a J.D. Vance figure or a Tucker Carlson figure or a Marco Rubio figure, right? Because when they reconsolidate, that's how they win elections. And that's how Trump won the 2024 election, was he managed to present himself ambiguously to a wide enough array of people that they could all attach to him their desires for what they wanted the future of the United States to be, while those desires were often contradictory within his own coalition. Those contradictions have really come to the surface.
Earlier in the conversation, you were talking about the NAR and other Christian nationalist movements as well are seeing politics not as ordinary political conflict, but as spiritual warfare, battle between God's forces and demonic enemies, controlling whole institutions and indeed nations. And I'm thinking about those who were the biggest parts of like efforts to overturn the 2020 election, were people that had that frame of Trump being divinely chosen and insisting that any defeat must be illegitimate. And now, as there's war abroad, there's the growing repression at home, how do you see these movements relating to the upcoming elections and the fight for political power going forward?
I think in the 26th election, they frankly don't need to be unified to rig an election. They have control over all the kind of political levers that they need to. And a lot of that, I think, is functionally right now more or less on autopilot in the mind of Stephen Miller, and the implementation through DHS, through the kind of organisms and the kind of infrastructure of Republican politics. So part of the playbook of an authoritarian movement, like what MAGA is to rig elections. And when a political coalition in a democracy starts claiming that the last election was rigged, that is their promise to rig the next one. And I was actually one of the people watching in the lead up to the 24 election, as all the people who tried to overturn the 2020 election were saying, let's get into the mix on this one. And I think that if Trump had been declared the loser of the 24 election, it would have been way worse than what we saw in 2020 with January 6th. I think it would have been an even more intense effort to overthrow the election and overthrow our democracy. These folks are not capable at this point of accepting election losses. And so I think there will be huge efforts to play with the election results in the lead up to it, to try to kind of fix the election in certain ways. And I think there will be real efforts after the election, if they lose, and especially if it looks like they're going to lose both houses of Congress, to try to monkey with the results and really try to play with the tools of power, the levers of power in Washington and in the states, to try to rig this election even in the aftermath. I think what we're going to see in 2026 is going to pale in comparison to what we're going to see in 2028, because these folks have realized that as much as Congress might be symbolically important and it have some kind of guardrails that they can impose upon the executive, at this point, so much power has been consolidated in our executive branch that the whole ballgame from their perspective is in the executive branch, and in having their people maintain control over the executive branch with all of its attendant powers. And I think they are not going to allow anyone else to take over the executive branch without a massive fight that may very well be an actual physical fight. I think that is the level we're at. And I think all of us need to be right now thinking about and marking in our mind where our red lines are. And as citizens in a democracy, we are the ones who are ultimately responsible for maintaining and upholding our democracy, right? It's the demos, it's the people ultimately who are responsible. And I think we need to be knowing in our minds what line getting crossed would put me in the streets as a protester. And that's the last line of defense when an authoritarian tries to steal an election, because sometimes the local elected officials fail and sometimes the courts fail. And at that point, then it becomes about peaceful protest resisting the authoritarian turn and trying to hold on to our democracy in the streets. I'm not a prophet. I can't predict the future, but all indications are those lines will probably be getting crossed for a lot of us this year.
I want to thank you so much, Matt, for walking us through these very complex paths that we are now all being thrusted upon as it pertains to both the various strands of Christian nationalism and the big tent that is Trumpism and what it bodes for all of humanity, those of us living within these borders and globally. So I want to thank you for your insight, your expertise, your perspective, and of course, your time. And where do you want people to go so that they can connect more with your work these days?
So I've got a new book coming out this fall titled Defying Tyrants, Following Jesus in a World of Christian Antichrists. Very much intended for a Christian audience. I welcome other readers, but this is a theological book trying to take on these issues of Christian supremacy and Christian imperialism and Christian nationalism. If you want to find out more about that, you can go to my website, drmatthewdtaylor.com. Find me on Substack, Matthew D. Taylor's Reckonings, and follow me there and connect with me there. And I welcome people's interaction with my work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The attacks on immigrants is one of the central battering rams for the Trump regime, built on a quote unquote immigration crisis that is widely exaggerated and where even real problems are deliberately distorted to justify repression. At the same time, this regime openly tramples the rule of law, declaring it will not be restrained by courts, by Congress, or by international law as it wages wars of aggression and carries out its agenda. And all of this is happening at a dizzying pace, atrocity piled upon atrocity piled on atrocity to disorient and demoralize those who would oppose it. One of the most chilling warning signs right now is the rapid expansion of concentration camps in this country. To get into this, here is my interview with Andrea Pitzer. To help us understand the moment that we're in, the grave danger that we face, particularly for our immigrant siblings, I am so honored to speak with Andrea Pitzer, author of One Long Night, A Global History of Concentration Camps. She also has a wonderful newsletter, Degenerate Art, and she hosts the Next Comes What podcast. She's spent years studying how concentration camps are built, expanded, and normalized. And at a time when detention infrastructure is rapidly growing in the United States, her work helps us understand what we're confronting and most essentially, what it will take to stop it. I want to welcome you, Andrea. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Sam. I'm so excited is not the right word, but I'm so glad to be here with you.
Likewise. You have researched and covered in an ongoing way the international use of concentration camps. I know as somebody who worked to mobilize opposition to George Bush's torture and prison camp in Guantanamo, Cuba, that this term is used more or less accurately sometimes, with the most prominent examples that people have associated with Nazi Germany. To kind of ground this conversation, what actually is a concentration camp and what does it mean when a government begins to operate what you've called concentration camp regime?
Well, I'm really glad you're starting with that because I do think people, when they hear the phrase concentration camp, they do almost instinctively think of Auschwitz, as they should, in my opinion. If there's this, long field of concentration camps over the last 130 years on 6 continents, which is the period of time I looked at, and I'll get to that in a minute, then Auschwitz looms as this enormous tower above everything. This is the sort of the nadir of humanity, the worst thing that is possible to do, the thing that we never want to approach again. But it didn't get thrown off an alien spaceship and land on Earth. It emerged from societies that are here on Earth. And what it emerged from was what I actually call the concentration camps. And I want to be clear that Auschwitz and its sibling extermination centers were something that Nazi Germany added on to its existing concentration camp system mid-war. But by that point, that concentration camp system in Nazi Germany had existed almost a decade. And so those camps, and those names are a little bit less well known to most people, but Dachau is the most common one, I think, that people still have some memory of. Dachau and its siblings in that location at that time in the 30s were saying it didn't look that different than other systems that have existed around the world, some of which were quite horrific, some of which on first blush we might not think they are so bad, but which I found this through line for all of them. So the definition of a concentration camp became the mass detention of civilians. So we're not talking prisoner of war camps. We're talking civilian detention, mass detention of civilians without due process or full trial on the basis primarily of identity. So something about the person. It could be political affiliation. It could be religion. It could be race or ethnicity. It's been all those things in history. So primarily on that basis, rather than on the basis of a specific thing they've done. And so that said, I want to come in and add a few caveats to that definition because I think they're important. It is not to say that the people involved never had any kind of trial or never any kind of formal sentencing, but that in whatever place they lived at that time, they were put into a camp that was an end run around the normal legal justice system that existed. Concentration camps are always an end run around that kind of thing. The other thing to keep in mind is that when I say detention is primarily on the basis of identity over something they've done, we see again and again that concentration camp societies, places where they can take root, you'll see the powers that be making it illegal to be a certain kind of person in that state. It isn't that there's never a law that's been broken, but those laws have usually been instituted fairly late in history and with the specific target of identifying this group of people that they want to lock up. So in Nazi Germany, as people realize, Jews were targeted. They were targeted from very early in the Nazi regime. Citizenship was stripped. And I just want people to think for a second about that. What does that mean? That means what Hitler wanted to do. And he said this in letters more than a decade before the Nazis took power. He said he wanted Jews to become aliens, to be treated as aliens. So literally what they wanted to do was to turn them into illegal aliens in Germany at that time. And so it took several years to do that. And it isn't until 1938 or so that we see the mass sweeps of Jews and the kind of street sweeps that we're seeing now in the US actually with immigrant detention. But again and again, countries resort to this when a party or a leader wants to entrench or expand power. And the way that they see that is strategic to do that is to pick an out group, a scapegoated group. And usually it has been scapegoated before they get on the scene. So they usually don't have to do it from scratch. Sometimes they do, but more often they're leaning into whatever are the cultural gaps and fissures that exist in that society at that time. And it is done as a political strategy to garner that power, picking on this vulnerable group that everybody in that society at that time, or at least enough people will agree is somehow endangering the nation. That's a really long answer to your short question.
When you look at what's happening today, particularly in the US, because I feel like it would be a whole different conversation to talk about internationally, but when you look at what you see unfolding in the US, are there historical examples that you think are especially instructive or you find to have the most prescient parallels? And what are the key lessons that you take from them?
I'm really glad you asked that question because along with when I give the definition of a camp, I usually try to say that I looked at camps from the 1890s forward because there is this moment where in time, and it's actually a short period of like 20 years or so, but it's a really significant period for detention purposes in which barbed wire and automatic weapons are invented, patented, and in mass distribution. After that point is when you can use a small guard force to hold a lot of people and control a lot of people. So it transforms a kind of detention that existed before modern concentration camps. And so to answer your question, I'll say, let's go back before that period to talk about some of the real roots of this in America. And when I say in America here, literally, I would mean the Americas, but I'll try to be clear about Americas versus United States so that we know where we're at in history in this answer. But you can't get to modern concentration camps, the barbed wire and automatic weapons concentration camps, without looking at the history of colonialism and imperialism, especially with the Spanish in the Americas, which a lot of people don't think as much about now. And then also in significant ways with the British in Africa, Asia, and North America, and with then the US government after the United States becomes its own country. And the reason I say that is because there is a long, long history of forced removal of people. And think of concentration camps as removing a targeted group from society, right? It is literally saying they are not worthy to be part of regular society. And so we are going to exile them somehow from that and do it in a way that will involve detention. And so we see Native American removal. We see, of course, genocide is the extreme version of that kind of erasure from society. But in terms of the camp version, where people are relocated to somewhere else, the reservation system that grows up under the Spanish, there's a lot of forced removal to do labor, to do different things in certain communities and mission communities. And you also see some fort detentions in military forts. But you don't see the kind of detention that we get later because it would just took too many troops to hold people. The Native American populations were quite large initially. And so you can't kind of get to the modern camp, but it would be impossible to get where we are without those forerunners. And quick note, because a lot of people say, well, does slavery count in that? And I would say, first of all, this is not in any way a competition about which thing was worse. I think the shame of Native American genocide and the shame of chattel slavery are two of the hugest stains, certainly in the US and in the world, that have happened. But slavery, when I explain it, it functions kind of through a different lens, which is what the concentration camp tendency is to remove a group that's in society from society, usually to benefit some way politically and sometimes to take that land from them. And I'll come to that in a minute. But the thing that is done with chattel slavery, it's literally kidnapping and bringing in a population specifically to take their labor from them. And so they're both horrific. They both do damage across generations. They both can lead to genocidal conditions, but they have kind of different origin points. So if we look at the US, there's that early history where we have all that going on. And then we also have during World War I. In World War I detention, this was a point at which there had been these colonial camps that were extremely cruel around the world, and they were really looked down on as inhumane. But then in World War I, there was this idea that we needed to lock everybody who was an alien, an enemy alien, up and kind of keep them behind the barbed wire for the duration. And the US came to the war late, but by then the European powers were already doing this, and the US did it too. And it was a much less lethal form of detention because there was so much pressure sort of for PR purposes of who was the really civilized nation, the one that would treat these detainees well. And also, we're not animals, we won't be barbaric. So you see weird things like lending libraries. You could send people money. You know, it's not what you think of when you think of, say, Dachau. Yet it's still incredibly psychologically damaging to be locked up on the basis of who you are. Let's say you were a German and you lived in the US for 30 years and you'd been a grocer in your community. Suddenly you're locked up because we're at war and you hadn't ever done anything. You had no idea when you were going to get out. You literally lost control over every aspect of your life. And along the way, you might have lost your business. You might have lost your spouse if they were not, of the same ethnicity as you. Who knows what would have happened? So this was still damaging, but around the globe, it set the stage. And then we come to this extremely shameful piece of American history in which some 120,000 Japanese Americans were put into what is called internment. I do include them in the concentration camp definition. And it's that World War I definition of these internment camps that is brought back. But this time it is much, much worse because it is done to Japanese Americans in the West Coast regions as a whole. Most of them, the majority of them, were actually American citizens. And to have stripped them of that citizenship, denied them the benefits of that citizenship in order to punish them visually in a way that benefited a number of political actors in the US at the time was a truly shameful thing. And again, was not done on the basis of any crimes that they had committed. And in fact, there was a naval intelligence report that said at the time it would be a mistake to do this, that you would actually run the risk of creating an espionage community for people that were not in detention in order to avenge the people that were detained, and that Japanese Americans as a community were not a threat to the country. And this was brought to the highest levels of US government, and yet it was ignored. So that's a very shameful moment. And I'll give you one last one, which is that during the Tulsa race massacre, which a lot of people have heard about in recent years, in 1921 or 22, Black Wall Street in Tulsa was burned down. And the Black survivors from that community were actually rounded up and put into what was called concentration camps in newspapers at that time. And they were not allowed to leave on their own. They would not be released until white people came to vouch for them, usually their employers. So again, this is something that does have serious roots in American history. And then there's also Guantanamo, which I visited twice, in which you mentioned. So we already have that in the kitty as things to think about as well.
You outlined really important historical examples of the roots in the United States of concentration camps, and unfortunately plentiful examples here and around the world. Is there anything that you find helps make sense the most to the moment that we're in now? Nothing exactly replicates. Every society has different expressions, as you were talking about earlier, that it's relying on. But I'm just wondering if there's anything that is helping you right now make the most sense of what we're experiencing.
There's 2 or 3 little things I'll try to run through. First of all, there are people who will say, well, these aren't concentration camps. And you hear this a lot. I think it's important not to use the term to say, like, we are at Auschwitz, because we are very decidedly not at Auschwitz. We have so much power and so much freedom to act, and we are not yet creating any kinds of death factories. So I worry sometimes when people use the term, if you are using it to scare yourself or scare other people, please stop, because that's not helpful. We don't need to be terrified in this moment, because if we just give in to some kind of terror, it's likely to paralyze us. So I would say there are all kinds of things we can do. But I do think the word concentration camp is useful, because when I've looked at these 130 years of modern camps, literally from the first 2 examples. So we have example 1 with the Spanish trying to put down rebellion in Cuba. Example 2 is the British in the Second Boer War in Southern Africa. And that second example with the British, when somebody says, hey, is this the concentration camps that Spain was doing in Cuba? People are like, nope, nothing to do with that. These aren't concentration camps. Ours are nothing like that. We're civilized. So literally from the beginning of this whole period, the first time somebody could compare it, they were already saying, no, we're not running concentration camps. That's not the right word for it. But they, in fact, fit this definition. So if you find yourself wondering, yes, this is an ongoing question. And yes, those always turn out to be, those people were not any worse than the people putting them in camps, just like every other example that we've had in history, right? So that's one thing to keep in mind, is it is actually a real term that is useful to understand these ways people have talked about it before. It mimics the same dialogue we're having right now. But the other thing that emerged from studying it was that, again and again, the thing that gave the best chances to halt or undo this kind of detention, sometimes it was external force. So invasion, loss, and war, something like that. And that's unlikely to happen with the US today. So I think we should just set that one aside. We'll have bigger problems. We'll have lots and lots of problems if we get to that point. But in terms of where we're at now, having even a semi-functioning judicial system and having the ability to dissent, to protest publicly, whether in print or on the streets, to have public dissent. Those are the 2 most important things for sort of reeling camps in whatever setting that they came from. And so that gives me tremendous hope, because those are the 2 things basically we've got less. You almost always see the legislative branch collapse in a society where you get to this point, because again, it isn't something that lands from an alien spaceship. It's something that emerges from the society along its flaw lines. And in those kinds of settings, you either have such a corrupt legislative branch or one that's been kind of strategically disempowered by the circumstances, or some combination of the 2. It's rare that the leading energy of stopping this comes from, and we see that very much today. Even some of those who are trying quite hard are not able to do what the institution should be able to do. And we see a number of leading Democrats, they just think like, well, let's reform ICE. And they don't yet understand we have developed and are witnessing a tremendous structural flaw. So again, if you ever find yourself wondering, like, what is it we're looking at? Just say, okay, we have masked men who can't be identified working out of loyalty to a supreme leader, kidnapping people off the streets, shooting American citizens in the face or in the back with no investigations allowed afterward. And they are taken very quickly to in between, what in concentration camp lingo, transit camps, to hide them from any legal help or authority. And then they are transitioned to somewhere else where they are put in mediocre to horrific conditions, depending on where they end up, with the express intent of pressuring them to give up any legal rights they have and to submit to what the government wants to happen. And even with that, I just read a case yesterday of Otay Mesa in California, a young person who identifies as Alex has been on a hunger strike because they've been there month after month. I think it's 10 months now, might be even longer. And they have actually been volunteered to be deported, and the government will not deport them. So, what is the actual point? Overall, I think Stephen Miller would like to remove these people from society. But it is clear that the most important thing right now is to make this process so horrific and so terrifying that it changes the nature of the country and whether these communities could continue to exist in the U.S.
So I think that one of the points that you made earlier in the conversation and that you make in your work is that the concentration camps function outside normal legal frameworks. And I was wondering if you could just share a little bit about why that has to be such a defining feature for them.
It is because every society has some kind of agreed on legal system. Now, I mean, some of them that I looked at, you and I would find horrific and quite harsh. Let's say under the Tsars in Russia, that was not an ideal legal system. It wasn't a democracy. But in each case, when a wannabe dictator, when a strongman or authoritarian comes to power, they want more. And we see that with Trump. It's like every time he does something, he needs the next thing, right? There is a desire for more and more and more power. That impulse is directly at odds. Even though they use the rhetoric of law and order, what they really mean is, I want to be able to punish you and never be punished myself. It's never really law and order. When they come up against their own legal systems, there are things they want to do that they cannot do. And then how do you get to do those things? First of all, you disempower your rivals or your, let's say, the legislature, the things that can be checks on you. If you can just lock up who you want to, when you want to, then that's kind of the perfect idea of what a dictator wants to be able to do. But you can't do that in most societies. So concentration camps rise to fill that need, but they almost always start with that targeting of the out group first, because that's who you can get away with doing it to. And it usually still takes years of propaganda. And that's something we've seen with the US against immigrants. This is long-term propaganda efforts that I think the Democrats have not always resisted. And the way I kind of frame it, and I don't mean to joke too much about it, but it's kind of like the Goldilocks level of cruelty to immigrants that people will say should happen. And with the Republicans, it's like, we should punish them all a lot. And with the Democrats, it's often, well, we should punish them some. We should be willing to be cruel, but not as cruel as those guys. And the answer is, why would you have arbitrary cruelty to any population, especially one that your economy depends on, especially one that are often model citizens that sometimes believe in the ideals of your country more than the native-born population even do, that the country is built on? Why would you do that? And we've just normalized that. And I use that as an example because people will say, well, yeah, but you grew up with that. So that seems normal if you live here, right? It is not actually normal, but you will see that exact dynamic happen where even now, sometimes I talk to people in Europe and they will talk about the Roma and the Sinti, which were then called gypsies and were targeted for genocide, just as the Nazis targeted German Jews and European Jews for extinction. They were also targeted, and they were relying on centuries-old prejudice against a population that moved around a lot. You will still hear people say that today. And if you say, do you hear yourself? Do you understand what that sounds like? They will say, oh, you just don't know because you don't know these people. You'll hear the same thing about like immigrants. Well, you don't know because you just don't see them that often, or you don't have to deal with the problems. It should be unacceptable to treat any population on the basis of who they are rather than any specific crime. But you see it happen again and again.
I just really appreciate that clarity. And I feel that sometimes people who are opposed to what is happening now in this new level of what I feel is a program of ethnic cleansing, that this is the mission of our government right now, to cleanse this country of, non-white immigrants. And I think that sometimes people, in calling that out correctly, will ignore the ways in which previous immigration enforcement was not just either, because they want to focus on the now. And I think that there's a way in which we can say that immigrants are full human beings, and anybody who talks about them being less doesn't represent our interests. And what we see now is qualitatively different.
And I think that, people have lost track of that. So I'm definitely not one of those people. And I do hear people say, it's always been this way. You just weren't paying attention. And it's fact, it has been bad and it needed more attention, perhaps even from me directly. I'm willing to cop to that. maybe as a child, I should have seen this. Maybe as a young adult, I should have seen this better than I do. But I will tell you that when I was growing up, I was in elementary school at the bicentennial. And here we now are at the 250th anniversary. And I grew up in West Virginia, which is like one of the least diverse racially or in terms of immigration states in the country. And the thing was, yay, we are a nation of immigrants. In 1776, there was some weird terminology. We're a melting pot. We're this, we're that. But it was, yay, immigrants. Look what we all made together. It was a positive message, even as some of these really horrific treatments were happening. I don't want to minimize the past whatsoever, but there was a public narrative that was a hypocritical narrative in many ways in terms of what was actually happening. But there was at least this lip service and promotion of an idea of the country that we were greater together when this different. And it's like, foolish me, I bought into that as the idea of the country. That was the country I imagined I was growing up in. And so we see that through Operation, and I hate to use a slur, but I'll use it briefly here, Operation Wetback under Eisenhower, we see that the roots of abusive immigration, deportation, this stuff has happened for a long time. And we talked about some of that earlier history. But I do not agree. I absolutely do not agree with the people that say this is no different than. And I'll give two examples of that, which is one is that now they are trying to expand it to more people, like to shoot Renee Good and Alex Priddy, two white people who would be extremely sympathetic in PR coverage and things like that, for them to feel empowered to do that to U.S. citizens in public tells you how that lens is broadening in terms of who they feel that they can target. So first of all, I think fewer people are safe than would have been safe in those earlier times when prejudice existed and the hate was applied more narrowly. But the other way in which I'll say it's quite different is that we right now have, I haven't seen the March numbers yet, I don't think they're out, but about 70,000 immigrants in immigration detention. That's about a 75% increase over Joe Biden, who, by the way, was being pretty hard on because he didn't want to lose politically. He didn't want to have that used against him. He didn't want it to not be able to do the things he wanted to do because immigration was a distraction. So in his 4 years as president, he was not particularly forgiving or helpful and kept some of those Trump policies. But even now, we're 75% increase over the Biden era already. And with this warehouse project that they are looking to establish, they've just been talking about this now for the last couple months. They're going to acquire all these warehouses around the country, which some people are fighting back against beautifully. If they get what they want, they are planning to add another 80,000 beds. And so that would put us at about 150,000. And that is, to give you some perspective, 6 to 7 years into power in Nazi Germany, the Third Reich had around 1939, 22,000 people in concentration camp detention. And it was a smaller country than the US is now, but we have currently more than 3 times as many as were in Nazi concentration camps 6 to 7 years into Nazi rule. I mean, to me, that is shocking. And so it is different. It is worsening.
I really appreciate that breakdown and how we can make sense qualitatively and quantitatively of what's shifting and how they are radically remaking society. My understanding is that this expansion, this warehouse network, they're using the funding from the Big Beautiful Bill, the funding that makes ICE's budget like equivalent to the 13th largest military in the world if compared internationally. I think it makes it 3 times more funding for ICE in particular. And I'm wondering, with these camps, what else are we seeing with this development besides the number that we're seeing? What else do you think people need to know about how these funds are being used? Or should we expect more of these family detention centers like Dilley?
I think you are going to see more family detention. There are a couple things. One is something we're already starting to see now, which will bring it more in line with what people think of when they think of concentration camps. I don't know if you saw, but Camp East Montana, they just announced a measles wave sweeping through yesterday. And so it's actually shuttered to outsiders at this point to try to control that. And we have had TB outbreaks already. We've already seen measles cases. With this warehouseification project, they're talking about 7,500, 8,500, 10,000 people in one location. And if you saw those maps that were going around in incredibly tight quarters, So we're going to see a lot more contagious diseases. Unfortunately, what RFK is doing with Health and Human Services is nightmarish for the country as a whole, but it will be particularly nightmarish for those in detention because, for instance, with measles, unvaccinated and undervaccinated populations, it's actually a lethal disease. I think that the health conditions, which are already quite terrible in many of these places, we hear about not being able to go to the bathroom, feces being around, not getting access to medicine or to medical care, being forced to drink dirty water, that not having a clean water supply. And each one of those things that I just named are from the beginning of concentration camp history. What has actually made the most people sick and killed the most people in concentration camp history is these exact things that we're talking about: access to water, enough food to live on, disease coming through, and that will be the biggest thing. So that's something that I think that we will be expecting to see more of. I think that we will also see that there will be choke points is a prediction that I have, that they are creating all these beds. The goal that they have stated is that they want to remove, and they've said crazy numbers all over the time, but the consistent ones you've heard have been like 15 to 20 million people. And you can't actually effectively move that many people very quickly. You certainly can't do it by giving them the hearings and things that they're supposed to. And this is partly why they're creating these camps. They want to put legal facilities, courtrooms right there and do it all extremely quick. But this was the similar goal that they had for Guantanamo. They wanted to be able to do it offshore for the US so they could set up a courtroom and do quick and, I would say, dirty justice and make a public spectacle and have it done. And here we are 24 years later. And the biggest case, the 9/11-5, have still never made it to trial. And so the idea that if they just have enough beds and they put the courtrooms there, they're going to be able to deport everybody. Not only would that be unbelievably devastating to American society, to U.S. society, even if they could do that, what history shows us with these camps is that they cannot do that. What I think you're going to see also, there's going to be, even when they have extra beds, if they are able to get it, and let us do everything we can to keep them from getting that, there is going to be overcrowding. There are going to be people that have been sitting, as this person, Alex, in Otay Mesa camp, asking even to be deported in some cases. And the government is going to be in these punitive roles. And a big part of it is going to be the bureaucracy itself gets overwhelmed. They intend bad enough things, but there will be bad things that happen they do not even intend. And now some people say that's when they're going to start shooting everybody. And I think we are a long way from anything like that. And again, we should not be terrifying ourselves, but it is bad enough what people are surviving right now. And it is bad enough that we have a good idea that conditions are going to get worse. But I think that they seem to be moving away from what I call the Everglades camp, which a lot of people refer to as Alligator Alcatraz, and East Montana, where they've had these multiple deaths, one of which was already declared a homicide. And I think they're looking for these already built infrastructure things. But that is not going to be a magic bullet to resolve these issues that they've had in the other places, because even there, I think the one in Tremont, I looked it up, how many people live in Pennsylvania that they're looking to do, how many people live in the community versus how many detainees there would be. And I think it was a 5-to-1 ratio. They do not have the water, the sewer, the power. They do not have all that stuff. And so then they're looking to use this Navy expeditionary contract where they're funneling the money from the last year's budget bill into a Navy contract that then treats the U.S., I think this is so interesting, as another region of the world, basically as a foreign entity. And you can use people that have been approved as these contractors to stand up things very quickly. And so I suspect we're going to see them trying to build power facilities, trying to come up with water facilities to go with these warehouses. But I've been to Gitmo, and that's how they built Gitmo as well. And it is not smooth and simple. You can't move that many people. When they say 15 to 20 million, in over 20 years of its existence, about 18 million people went through, in one form or another, the Soviet Gulag. And that was over more than 20 years. And they're talking about moving that same number of people through in one presidential administration. It cannot happen humanely. It can only happen extremely inhumanely.
As we close out our discussion, I want to end with a bit of hope on a solid foundation of your historical foundation that you've walked us through and that you've spent so much time working on. One of the things that I appreciate about your writing and your podcast is that with the crimes of this government, you also share what people can do. I encourage everybody to go and subscribe to Andrea Pitzer's Degenerate Beehive. It's linked in the show notes. But I'm wondering, What do you see as the most important things that are giving you hope that people should pay attention to, and any ways that you see people acting that you're like, if more people were doing that, we could change the game?
First of all, I just want to reiterate, to make it 100% clear, we are better poised to slow and stop this than any of the places I looked at across those 130 years of history. We have more freedom on the whole. Not everybody is that free, but most of us, most US citizens particularly, especially people like me, middle-aged white folks, have that kind of liberty and are less likely to be arrested by the police, are less likely to face this kind of harm. There are so many things that we can do every day, and I am just inspired endlessly. And that movement is already happening. It is already forming. We have already had what might have been, was certainly one of the top 2 or 3 biggest single days of protest in U.S. history last year. There's another one, a No Kings protest coming up March 28th that I suspect will be the biggest ever. And people say, well, but what does that really do, protest? And what I would say is, if you are showing up in your community, you will find other people, you will hear about what's going on, and you will find ways to plug yourself into. There is so much happening at every level. I guarantee you, somewhere in your community, somebody is working on helping immigrants that are facing legal issues, that are facing food and rent issues, diaper banks, food banks. So not everybody can be out and networked, but I think physically being out and networked, because so much of this is happening at the local level, you can certainly call your reps, and I encourage you to call your political representatives and keep pressure on there. But so much of what is exciting and dynamic is happening on the ground. We saw it in Chicago. We saw it in Minneapolis. We're still seeing it. People are coming out, keeping vigils over people that are detained, reminding people in their community what's going on. If you go to Salt Box Project, you will see the map of warehouses that are planned, and you will hear and read about all the ways that people are fighting back and sometimes succeeding in getting those canceled entirely. And even people that have to stay home with elders or with their children. I see people using 3D printers to make whistles and ship them to people, or creating zines about know your rights, and in Spanish language ones or different language ones, so that people will know what numbers they can call if they get detained, or if they're at home and the ICE is outside, what they can do. I just see people showing up for each other. And it's important to say that this is not just, oh, let's help these poor victims. I mean, certainly there are terrible abuses that are happening, but this is like, what society do you want to live in? Do you want a society that can do this to people? And it turns out, and it's wonderful to find out, most Americans don't want that society. And so by you showing up and saying that publicly somehow, it lets other people know that you don't like it, they don't like it, and it's actually making ICE super, super unpopular. It's making this government super, super unpopular. And every time we can move that even an inch, it opens new doors.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Sam, for having me on, and best wishes to everything you guys are doing as well.
Thanks for listening to Refuse Fascism. Support the show by becoming a patron at patreon.com/refusefascism, subscribing to our Substack, or picking up some of our merch. See the show notes for all those links. And for $0, you can help grow this show by sharing the episode, rating and reviewing on Apple Podcasts or your listening platform of choice, and recommending our Substack to others. Stay connected and get involved at refusefascism.org and on social media at refusefascism. You can also text REFUSE to 855-755-1314, so you're always in the loop about developments and actions. Thanks to Richard Marini, Lena Thorne, and Mark Tinkleman for helping produce this episode. Until next time, in the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America.